to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. Today, we're going to talk about something a little bit different about. As I've done this show over the years, as I've worked with, countless people, veterans, whatever, what have you. There's one thing that I've noticed a lot of. Most of us become incredibly compassionate when someone we care about is hurting, right? We allow and make space for grief and their trauma and loss, all of these different things, right? For the most part, I want to believe most people genuinely want to help. We accept that, somebody's going to need their time and space and give them some patience because that's what we do when we're caring about another person and a human being. And I actually think that's one of the better parts about us, right? About our humanity. Where I become interested, though, is that there seems to be a point in some relationships, regardless of what they are, familial, work, whatever, where changes occur. Now, pain is still real, right? But the relationship itself begins revolving around the wound. And conversations, all of a sudden, they become very, very difficult to have, right? So the person trying to help slowly starts wondering whether they're allowed to have needs of their own anymore inside of this conversation. And what am I looking at, Chris? What are we talking about here? What we're talking about is when somebody weaponizes pain as a sword against us, right? It is the other side of closure. It is a deeper question psychologically here than I've asked. Because we all think about closure. We need to, grieve and mourn and all these things, or accept loss. Maybe a relationship ended, or, we working for a promotion for 3 years and turns out we're going to be let go, right? We have to grieve all these things. It's closure. But this is when that closure doesn't happen. It goes a different direction. And that's what we're going to look at today. I know a lot of you are questioning, hey, this is weird. Or why are you going this? Because it does affect our dynamics. And I'm going to get into that a little bit later. Now, before I do all of that, as I always do, I want to take a moment and thank everybody who continues to listen in, join the show. As more of you are starting to listen to the show around the world, and send me messages, I do want to acknowledge something. I've gotten quite a few listeners from Nairobi, and I've got a couple of wonderful, thankful emails. I know nothing about your scene in that part of the world at all. I don't know what it looks like in Kenya. I would love to hear more about BDSM or fetish or anything if you want to take a moment, expand on that for me. Also, for a couple of you listeners in from different parts of China, I don't really know. I guess you found me on YouTube, but thank you. I got your messages. Right? These conversations, they touch you all, and they help explain some things that you're feeling, and that's why we do this. That's why I sit here week in, week out for these 5 years doing this, because I want to make sure that we all kind of get that information, right? So with that said, if you're following me on Spotify, do me a favor. It makes me really happy. Click on your app, go to the little dots, hit the 5 stars, rate the show. That allows others to find the show. If you are on YouTube, like, subscribe. You'll know when the new show drops. On Apple, do the same thing. Go over there on your app, hit it, rate it 5 stars. Really want to keep the show growing. I want more people to be able to find the answers and the questions that they may have, and maybe they can find them here, right? And if you'd like to support the work, there is a donation link in the show's description. Now, I want to comment on that real quickly. Recently, I've just had to change it. Yes, I put in a required amount, and let me tell you why. Some people were running credit cards illegally, and I got notified, so I've had to change it. So I'm sorry, but I think they put the minimum at like $5. So that's about the average that comes in anyway. It's not because I'm, saying that's what I'm worth, but I like to think I'm worth more. However, I just had to put in a limit because that'll stop those people who are doing bad things and using my show to do so. Anyways, all right, let's get back to this. So today, really, I'm not going to come in, I'm not attacking grief or trauma, obviously. those things obviously need a whole different level of compassion. I really want to explore that's something much, much more uncomfortable. At what point does a legitimate emotional wound stop being something we carry and quietly become something we use against people that are trying to love us or help us heal or just genuinely care about us? Because I don't think there's a lot of people that have ever asked this question. And I think that's one that we need to ask. And I'm going to tie this into lifestyle. I tie everything I do to the lifestyle or how relationships work. But in psychology, this is how stuff works. We start thinking about stuff and we look at the other side. So the first part here I want to talk about is how pain deserves compassion, because I've been thinking about lately how difficult it is to challenge someone who's genuinely hurting, not because we don't have something to say to them, because the moment we do, it can feel like we're attacking the wound instead of addressing the behavior. And that's, I think, problematic for a lot of us, because how do we handle this, right? It's a very uncomfortable place to stand. Imagine trying to tell your partner, or your coworker, or your parent that something, or a sibling that they're doing is hurting this fundamental relationship. Because before you even can utter a last word, you get reminded about their pain or betrayal or the reason all of this is even happening. And all of a sudden, the conversation isn't about what's happening in that space, it's whether you're insensitive enough to bring it up in the first place. And guess what? This changes the relationship, because now we're not talking about behavior. You're talking about whether you are allowed to even discuss the behavior. And I think that's a very important distinction, because they're two completely different conversations. We've all heard people say things like, I'm still healing. I just need my time, right? And those things are true. I'm not taking away from that. The wound is actually genuine. But I'm not interested in whether that pain exists. I'm interested in what happens when that pain becomes the answer to every difficult conversation that person's going to have, and how they're going to use it and directing it outward. Because if every relationship eventually arrives at a moment where two people need to be heard, right? Needs are going to change, the frustration builds, all of this. That part of being close to another human being, the difficulty here begins when one person's emotional issue and that wound becomes something the other person is no longer allowed to step around or even question, right? Without that becoming immediately a big problem and causing a fight. And at that point, the wound has stopped being part of the relationship. It started governing it. And that's the shift that we're going to talk about today, because I don't think most people see it when it starts to happen. We just are we assume when we're in that relationship, regardless of what it is, that if someone has deeply hurt, then everything that follows belongs under the same umbrella. Now, of course, that can be true at times, and other times it isn't. Pain quietly becomes the safest place from which to control another person. Sometimes, anyone who challenges what's happening around that narrative immediately gets accused of attacking the wound instead of addressing the behavior, right? I don't think we talk about this nearly enough, because relationships, regardless of what they are, right? One person here sees another hurt and they genuinely want to be compassionate. And the other has slowly learned that the wound ends in a very difficult conversation before it even begins, and not that they, even really want to discuss it. So, how does this wound change our roles? And I think this is the reason it's so difficult to recognize, because nothing is, there's not an overt change here. It's not some moment you've just decided that, hey, I'm going to start everything that's wrong and I'm feeling inside. I'm just going to start lashing out, right? And typically, when you ask these people, it's not going to be like, you know, they're not going to say that they're struggling. They are, or they're trying to figure out how to heal or make sense to what's happened, right? Most of the time, they're going to tell you the truth. But the problem is this emotional shift happens somewhere else and along the way. begins typically when that wound slowly becomes the answer to any difficult conversation, because we also are talking about avoidance, right? But not we're not leaning on that. Imagine trying to bring up that, you know, anything that's been bothering you in your relationship, and maybe you're feeling distant or confused, right? But the conversation, before it even gets a chance to, you're getting 3 or 4 sentences out, that other person is just reminding you about the betrayal they experienced, or the pain that they're carrying, or the closure that they're finding. So you're no longer talking about what happened between the two of you. You're defending yourself for bringing it up at all. And that's a very difficult conversation to have. And conversely, that's different. You weren't even talking about that. And at that point, the wound isn't simply being acknowledged. It's deciding it's actually not just deciding, it's dictating what can be discussed. And I think that's where the psychology here, for me, is the interesting part. Human beings naturally avoid conversations that make them feel guilty. If every concern you raise is met with a reminder of somebody else's suffering, you begin, editing yourself and catching the things you're going to say. You stop asking questions, right? And you choose every word you say carefully. You're just walking on eggshells, right? And if you do all this, eventually you stop speaking altogether, because you already know where the conversation's going to end up. And we were never asked to be put into this position. You just quietly learn the rules and you adjust it. And that's why I think pain here can become a shield, not because it protects someone from being hurt, but because it protects them from being challenged. The wound becomes untouchable. If you question the behavior, it sounds like you're questioning the pain itself. And those are two different things. I also think this is where the title of this episode today makes a lot more sense. When pain becomes a sword, it isn't just swinging wildly at strangers. And, there are times that people do lash out randomly, but there are consequences for that. However, typically the pain is pointed at people that are standing the closest to us, the very ones that we're connected to, right? That are trying to help, and we have burdened with that emotional cost, right? And what gets worse, they start apologizing for any reasonable questions that they have, and they start feeling guilty, right? And that anything that they're asking for us to do while we're hurting is somehow selfish. And let me tell you right now, that's a lonely place to live. And I want to be very clear about something. I'm not saying grief and trauma and loss, they have a deadline. They don't. People grieve at different stages for different things, right? But we're not just talking about death here. Let me be very clear. All right. We're not just talking trauma and its long lasting effects or betrayal. Life simply doesn't work that way, right? We know that there isn't a deadline. Discussed this with somebody last week, that how people go through these stages differently, right? No two people are the same. But what we do know is some of our experiences stay with us longer than other people, and some of these experiences stay with us forever. But what I'm asking here is something different. Has the wound become the very reason every conversation ends before it begins? That's an important question, because if it has, the relationship has changed. And you're no longer dealing with two people trying to solve a relationship problem or a work problem or a family problem. You've got one person that's managing and carrying the entire relationship, and the other person's pain has become the final authority here on what can be said, or what can be, questioned or even challenged. And that's the moment I think we all need to become very curious, not because the pain isn't real, right? But because the relationship deserves, it deserves to matter. And it also deserves to have a space that it can function and breathe and not be stifled. Now, before I get back into all of this show is supported by Enhanced Mind Counseling. And one of the things I believe is that lasting change starts when we stop looking only at what's happening and begin asking why it keeps happening. That's often where people discover they're not just dealing with a difficult relationship, they're dealing with patterns that have been shaping the way they connect with others for years. And that's the work I do with people. Looking beyond the immediate problem and helping them understand the deeper patterns driving it so they can build healthier relationships without losing themselves in the process. And if that's something you'd like to explore, you can reach out through my website. There's a link in the show's description. All right, let's get back to it. I want to talk a moment here. I want to talk about this part. I want to talk about the partner who stays, the person who stays. Because the person I actually feel for in a lot of these situations is often the one no one's talking about. Not because they're suffering more, but because they're suffering quietly. When someone you work with or you love that's a family member or a friend or relationship is carrying a genuine emotional wound, your instinct is you want to make life better for them. You want them to try to get over it as best they can so they don't feel that pain anymore. So we're patient, right? And you don't bring things up because it's just not the right time, right? And week after week starts going by and you tell yourself again, I'm just going to give them some space. I'm going to give them a little bit of time. And you know what we're doing? We're extending some kindness. Now, and in the beginning, it probably is. The problem, though, is that all of a sudden, there never is a right time to start talking about these things, right? And again, if we bring anything up, everything comes back to the wound. And now we're feeling disconnected. We don't want to work around them. We don't want to go to family functions or hang out with them or whatever, because that wound is all they're talking about. And sometimes you need to get back to work or you miss being around that person, you know? And you might come back and you might even say, hey, is the relationship okay? Right. And you somehow leave the conversation at some point apologizing for asking. And after enough time, if you keep doing this, something is going to change, especially inside of you. And first thing that's going to happen is you're going to just stop asking questions. Because if I come up and I know you're hurting and all I get is a lashed out response and it's all about them and it can never be about us, definitely not about me, well, I'm not going to ask anymore. And it's not because these questions just magically poof and go away. It's because I've now learned they're not welcome in this space. And let me tell you, that is one of the loneliest experiences a person can have inside of a relationship of any sort. All right. Work is a little bit different, but I mean, it still applies there. You're physically present and you're invested and you want to help and do the right thing. Right. But what you are noticing is you're disappearing from the conversation. All that other stuff, though, your needs and frustrations, they don't become less and they don't go away, but you're just not willing to give them a voice anymore because you already know what's going to happen if you do. And that's where that eggshell metaphor comes in, right? Because most of us look at that, think, that's just living or being around someone who's explosive or unpredictable, but it can be something that's softer. Because if we're constantly measuring whether my feelings are important enough to mention, right, that means now we have to start rehearsing a conversation in our head and even decide before I go and have it if it's worth having. And then I've got to carry all that disappointment privately, right? And my God, that feels more damaging, to keep it to yourself. And then guilt comes in. And that's a huge part of it because then you start feeling guilty for wanting any type of relationship to come back. Not just the relationship before the wound, right? The relationship where both of you just existed, where both people were allowed to, speak and have their ideas present, where both of you mattered. And that's a painful thing to admit because it almost feels selfish, but it isn't. No relationship can survive indefinitely if only one person's emotional reality is allowed into the room. You're going to suffocate the relationship, and subsequently, you're going to terminate it. And this is, I see this in kink. We rightly spend so much time talking about caring and respecting limits and consent and trust and all these things. And I talk about them as well, week in and week out, and I write about it. We all understand people's emotional injuries. We take this into account. And trust me, those things matter. They should. But if a Dom or a sub reaches a point where their pain becomes the reason every difficult conversation is postponed or redirected, that dynamic is going to become completely unbalanced. And the wound starts holding authority that neither person consciously agreed to give it, right? And I don't think most people intend for that to happen. I do think it's worth asking whether you've slowly become a spectator in your relationship, right? Let me explain that you're just making room for somebody else's pain while you're wondering where there might finally be room for you two. And that's really just a lonely place to sit, right? Now, healing isn't measured by distance here. And let me explain this. As I kind of wind this down today, I want to be careful that this doesn't become an entire episode about telling people to move faster or somehow to just get over it. That's not what I'm saying at all. Pain doesn't work on a schedule. And some losses and grief and need for closure and healing and all of these things will stay with us for the rest of our lives. I'm very well aware of this, right? But healing isn't about pretending those things never happen. It's about whether the wound slowly becomes part of your life instead of the thing that governs it all. And that's a very important distinction, because if every decision is going to be governed, how you talk to people, how you conduct yourself at work, whatever is all revolving around this wound, I think there's going to be a problem. And one of the questions I sometimes ask myself is whether a relationship is making room for healing or is it reorganizing itself around the wound itself. And those two things aren't the same. One allows both people to remain present, and the other gradually asks one person to disappear so the pain can remain undisturbed. And there is no time limit on that. And that other person could be lost for a very long time. And that's a difficult place for any relationship to survive. And I also don't think healing is measured by distance, right? There are times when space is necessary, right? It's the healthiest thing we can do for someone. The problem isn't asking for space. The problem is when distance quietly becomes the permanent, we just use that as a stopgap. And then we still expect the relationship to stand still and wait. That I don't, you can't measure a relationship that way. It's an unrealistic expectation. And no relationship can live in that space forever. Because eventually, both people need to be able to speak about the relationship and talk honestly and feel like they're not having to walk on these eggshells so they can advance forward and the relationship can evolve. Healthy relationships need to be able to disagree, ask questions, challenge each other without a conversation returning to that original wound. And if that's never becomes possible again, the relationship stops growing. And the only reason it stops growing is because one subject now dominates everything else. So now the relationship becomes untouchable. And I think that's where this episode really lands for me today. Yes, pain deserves compassion and it deserves patience and understanding. Very well aware of that. But what it should never become is the thing that decides whether another person is allowed to have a voice. And if you find yourself in that position, whether you're the one carrying the wound or the one trying to help someone through it, I think it's worth becoming curious Has the relationship started to, revolve around the injury instead of two people inside of it? And that's not an easy question to answer, but it may be one of the most important ones to ask, because healing isn't measured by how effectively we keep people at a distance. I think it's measured by whether we gradually, are able to let people who genuinely care about us back into the parts of our lives that pain once closed off. And that's not easy. And it's not going to happen overnight. But if we never move towards that direction, the wound doesn't just stay with us. It quietly begins deciding how every relationship around us is allowed to function. And eventually, that hurt person is going to end up alone. Why? And I'm not saying that as a guarantee, but for the most part, people don't like that silence where everything is around that. And I've had friends that were like that, wounded, and no matter what you did, no matter how you tried to help them heal, it was met with anger and viciousness and vitriol. And me personally, I walked away from one. And it wasn't for years until my friend came back and, apologized. At that point, though, I had to make a decision, right? Because the relationship was effectively over. Did I want to actually re-enter it? These are the new questions that surface. Right? But I'm not going to go down that road. Look, I don't want any one of you to walk away today thinking that I've spent this entire time telling people to hide their pain and just push through it and stop asking for understanding. That's not what I'm doing, right? It's not even remotely what I'm talking about. Life life wounds every one of us eventually. Not None of us get through it untouched. And that's just the honest truth. There's death or loss or relationships or bad jobs or problems at school or bad grades or whatever the question isn't whether we all carry pain, right? Or even at what point. We all will. The question is what kind of relationship we're going to have with it. And I think it's worth remembering that the people who stay beside us are rarely are they're not our enemies. They're usually the ones trying to understand us the best they know how. And I'm going to tell you, pardon me, they're not going to always get it right. They might say the wrong thing or ask you an awkward question, or maybe they're going to fail to appreciate just how heavy this feels for you right now. But that's part of being human. And so are we. I don't believe healthy relationships ask us to stop hurting, but I do believe they ask us to remain aware of they how our hurt has is starting to affect the people who are continuing to choose us every day. And I think that's a fair thing. That's a responsibility both people share, regardless who's carrying the heavier burden at the time. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away from today, it's this. Yes, pain deserves compassion, but it should never become the only voice in a relationship. So I'm going to give you my question as I do every week to think about, sit with quietly. I'd like to see the discussion. I ask you guys every week. It's the only thing I want. It makes Chris happy, right? Chris is going to speak in the third person. Chris gets happy when you all start answering questions, even if it's you emailing me, right? Chris gets happy, puts a smile on my face because I know that means you're interacting with these thoughts. And I know some of you come back later. That's fine. Um, Here's my question. Has your pain become something you're carrying, or is it something that's quietly started deciding how everyone else is allowed to love you? Okay, that's the one for today. I'm going to get to a couple of things. First, so I've covered the donation link thing. That's done for you guys. Number two, oh, look, I do a lot of shows. I'm sorry if you don't like everyone I've done, but if you tell me and you start calling me names, I'm just deleting your comment. I'm not reading it, right? Because I see something and you don't, and I talk about it. and you don't like it, and you think to start calling me like the word. I'm not a misogynist at all. I love women. Oh my God. But don't do that. So I'm not going to listen to it. Um, a couple shows I want to talk about that are slated. I've been getting this question, so I wanted to address it today. First, am I going to do a race play show? I absolutely am, because I think we need to have this conversation in reality. Because I think, especially a lot with Americans, right? And I'm American and something else. The reality is that I think we, as a big voice in the world, tend to say how we think about things, and we believe everybody else should follow it. That just doesn't work. That's called hubris. I'm not going to do that. Right? Um, I also know that when we've had that discussion on race play, and I've seen it play out, like I saw it heavy last year, and people want it off certain platforms, and it shouldn't be allowed because it's racism. Well, that's racism to you. But that's not the definition of it, because it goes other ways too, right? I have a friend of mine in the Netherlands. He absolutely loves it. He's a bull. I've had conversations with him about it, but we can alter that one too. It could be, what if a woman from China will only play and have sex with a guy from Venezuela, a Venezuelan man. That's it. No, nobody else. Why is that not right? But we can't answer that, right? It's not. So it really becomes a question, I think, about black and white. But we're going to get into that. That's one that's coming up. Politics. I keep getting this question. What, Chris? Why haven't you done a political show? Because first off, I'm not into politics here. I think it has a place. I'm very well versed in politics, believe it or not. It's just because I don't speak about it doesn't mean I'm not well versed. And I'm well versed on multiple sides for multiple types of leadership around the world, from the parliamentary system to presidentiary type systems to what I see in places like Russia and other places, right? I do understand it. I'm trying to figure out how to frame that one. And I have had a request for something that I'm sitting with right now. I don't know yet how I got to look out of this. How does this affect? But I'm going to leave it at this, because I believe it's hatred in the community, and it's quite disgusting. I don't like it. It has nothing to do with me making a choice. And if some of you frame it that way, that's fine. But I want to leave it like this. BDSM is supposed to be a place where we can come and I can let myself down. I don't need to be the therapist when I'm doing my scenes. I just get to be Chris the sadist. That's me. Now, I don't know about the rest of you. I don't really care what's going on in the scene, because that's why I don't go to dungeons anymore, because I don't want to watch people having sex, right? BDSM isn't about sex. If you don't like that, I'm sorry that offends your delicate sensibilities, but BDSM and sex are not synonymous. You can negotiate them in. That's completely fine. It's completely fine, but they are not synonymous. And I'm sorry if that upsets a lot of you. Just because you started having low grade porn and putting out videos, that does not mean it's BDSM. BDSM revolves around one concept, and that's total power exchange. If you don't have it and you don't understand even the point of what that is, you're not doing BDSM. It's not because I am old guard and I am not a gatekeeper. You can call me these things, and I don't mind it. I wear them proudly. But let me tell you, the difference between me and a lot of others is that I don't have the problems that seem to be coming up in all of this other stuff that's surfacing. Right? But I'm not going to get into that now, because it's just a whole other conversation. Right? So these are what's coming up. Right? We're about halfway, or a little over halfway through the year now. Can't even believe it. My God, we're close to Christmas. A lot closer to Christmas than we were a month ago. Right? Scary. Year's halfway over. It's hard to believe. But anyway, all that's happening, traversing, going on. So we got that. What else? I think that's it. I think that's got all for you guys this week. Just kind of give you a quick update on my writings and stuff. AMAs are still good. I'm still pumping them out. I'd like to hear, maybe you guys want to, if you want to get a hold of me privately, I'm thinking about doing another. I did one, I don't remember if it was last year or the year before, where I just did a show about AMAs, or actually questions people want to ask. You cannot ask me about my private life. I'm not going to talk about it. Again, the cover for some of the newer people coming in. The reason why is, let me make this very clear. So this doesn't sound like I'm hiding. I don't talk about my private life because a long time ago, many years ago, I worked with somebody who ended up threatening not my life, which I can deal with. That's part of the job. But they threatened people very close to me, and law enforcement got involved. All right. So there are things I don't need to disclose because I have the right to privacy. Right. I hate talking about it, but I get so many questions. And here's the other reason. I want to let you all know about this. I don't talk about myself, my school, or where I grew up and all that stuff. There are some really intelligent psychologists on this planet that I follow that do the work that I do and that I read their research, and they're brilliant. They were pioneers in their fields. But they've switched now. They've gotten older and their work they do is more centered around them, right? And they're very exorbitant costs. That's fine. I am not complaining. I think they've earned it. But if I do all that stuff, it's not what I can give to you all. It's not about this. I want to be able to help. I want to give you that. To give you a language to understand what you're feeling and what you're dealing with, so you can maybe at least have a question or an answer to a question. That's why I do what I do. Okay? And all the rest of it, the comments that I do this for myself, where it's all about social media or why do I have certain people on? Well, look, if I ask 100 people and one person happens to say they'll join and 99 don't want to, then don't complain about who I bring on the show because you got asked, right? Anyway, positive stuff. I am going to go. I'm going to go play at a llama farm this weekend. I know what I know what they are, and I love the fur. God, my God, they're just cute and fluffy. But here's the cool part: these are like mini llamas, right? Little baby ones. So I'm super excited, and it's for a really good cause. I had a friend of mine a long time ago when I lived in Atlanta. I had cerebral palsy, and so this is going to be it's a fundraiser, and I'm just going to go like spend an hour and donate money because I don't know I'm not a medical person, so I can't do any research, but that's what I'm going to do and to feel good about helping the planet. And I told you all I'd like to see more of that. I'm not doing this because I'm trying to save humanity. I'm one person, but if we want change in humanity, we have to be part of that change. We can't just expect, right, the bystander effect. We can't just sit there and expect somebody else is going to do it. Because guess what? Nobody is going to. So I'm being changed for what I want in a better world. And I hope you all want that too. Right? So go play with some puppies, go play with some kittens, go ride a horse or save a dolphin. I don't know. Do something. I like animals, but if you want to help like homeless, do it. Right? Email me about it. Tell me privately. If you don't want to share it publicly, tell me privately. I love hearing that stuff. Right? It knows, at least for me, that lets me know I'm inspiring you all to do something. It's a little bit better. All right. Enough of all this sappy crap. I ask you my question again. I'll leave it for you. Be up on the socials. I want to hear some stuff. We'll go from there. Has your pain, has a wound is it just something that you're carrying, or has that wound quietly started deciding how everyone else is allowed to be around you or love you? Think about it. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay tuned.